Justin Ford for From the Frontline. How governments harm you is the topic of tonight's episode. In the studio with me is Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder of Frontline Fellowship, who has been involved in serving persecuted Christians for over 40 years in 38 countries. Good evening, Dr. Hammond. Governments are meant to exist to serve and protect their citizens. Is that what is actually happening, or is the reality somewhat different?
Yes, vastly different. Romans 13 makes it clear it's the government's priority to be a ministry of justice, to be God's deacons of justice. That's actually the word used in Romans 13 and also in 1 Peter, that governments exist to be a deacon, a minister of justice, to protect their citizens and to punish criminals who threaten life, freedom and property. However, the reality is the greatest threat to life, freedom and property in the 20th century and the 21st century that we are now have been governments. And here we're not just talking about communist regimes such as the Soviet Union, which killed over 66 million of their own citizens, or communist Red China under Mao Zedong, which killed over 68 million of their own citizens. And you could go to Ottoman Turkey, which killed 1.5 million Christian Armenians in 1915 to 1917, or Uganda, where under Idi Amin, between 1971 and 1979, over 600,000 people, mostly Christians, were slaughtered by the brutal Amin government of Uganda. Or Cambodia, where over 3 million people were killed, about a third of the population of the country, under the Pol Pot Khmer Rouge terrorism. Or Rwanda, which I documented with the book Holocaust in Rwanda, where Christian Tutsis, something like 1.1 million people, were killed mostly at the hands of machete-wielding Interahamwe mass-murdering thugs mobilized by the government. So it's not just these mass-murdering governments that we're talking about, but even Western democracies have orchestrated false flag terrorist operations which have killed their own citizens. For example, Operation Gladio, which is now declassified, and we know NATO actually planned and carried out terrorist bombings, assassinations, hijackings in Europe, and it was done on their own people in Italy, in Spain, in France, in Germany. These were organized by the Western democracies themselves to coerce their population to accept greater control, less freedom, because of an external threat, which actually wasn't even an external threat. It was their own government perpetrating terrorism on themselves. And we know from America now that the largest terrorist attack, what they call domestic terrorist attack in American history, the Oklahoma bombing, it was actually orchestrated by the Clinton government themselves. The US government orchestrated this massive bombing of where hundreds of people died and thousands were injured, and massive damage done in Oklahoma City with the bombing of the so-called the headquarters of the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms Division of the FBI. Interestingly enough, all the FBI personnel were not in the office on that day of the bombing at that time. None of the children were in the children's nursery daycare center in there. And, you know, to think that a government can orchestrate this sort of level of terrorism on their own people. And that's not the only one. I mean, that's just a very well documented one. And people need to see the video documentary A Noble Lie, which exposed the Oklahoma bombing. So we've got a lot of governments that not only lie to their citizens, but actually murder them.
Vast amounts of taxpayer funds are poured into welfare. How effective have these government programs been?
Well, interesting, from the very moment that the United States government launched its so-called War on Poverty, Great Society under Lyndon Johnson after the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, which is another story. In these Western democracies don't just kill their own citizens, they even murder their own presidents on occasion, and then cover it up and murder everyone who's an eyewitness who upsets the narrative. So from the moment that Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, launched the War on Poverty, actual poverty has increased greatly in the United States. And at best, you can say these welfare programs have been counterproductive. And it's not just true for the United States. That's true for every country that has tried these massive welfare programs. They increase poverty. It's funny, you have a war on drugs and you get more drugs. You have a war on poverty, you get more poverty. It seems whatever the government puts their mind to, they make it worse. The question is this just incompetence or is this deliberate plan? And there's a lot of people convinced that, in fact, the plan is to increase the poverty. The plan is to increase the evils that they claim to be against, whether it's drug cartels and so on. So there's a wonderful book written by Thomas Sowell in the United States on the state against blacks, showing how the black people, before the war on poverty and before all the affirmative action programs which is meant to lift blacks up in America, the average black child, over 90-something%, were born in a two-parent home, in an intact home, and they went to church and they were literate and so on. And now, today, the vast majority of black children born in America are born to single-parent homes, and the state has taken over the role of the father. The men have been made dispensable, and what you're seeing in the United States now is that literally the vast majority of black children don't even know who their father is. As I say, Father's Day in Harlem is a time of great confusion. But it's not only that. In America, for example, they've got the highest abortion rate in the world amongst black people. So more than half of all black children conceived are aborted. It's the highest in the world. So I think in some parts of America, the average is 1 in 3 babies conceived are aborted. But amongst black people, it's more than 1 in 2. So that's staggering. So as far as welfare goes, the government claims, we care about you because you're giving lots of free things. But it's been proven to be an economic catastrophe because you remove incentive, you remove responsibility, you break down the families. And I've seen how this works. For example, when I've been ministering in Sudan, the families are strong. You go to Sudan and the children were well disciplined, respectful of elders, and the families were cohesive. But in Sudan, I'm talking about South Sudan, where the Christians are the majority, which I've done most of my work there, the families were strong, cohesive, divorce is almost unknown. But then when I went to Omaha, Nebraska, I saw a Sudanese congregation. I was invited to speak at the Sudanese congregation, and I was shocked. The children were so badly behaved. The children were in such bad attitudes. They're sitting there in church with baseball caps turned around, wearing all kinds of ridiculous clothing that doesn't fit and just about hangs off you, these things where they pay for clothes that don't fit you and junk like that. And then the bad attitudes, shocking. Then I learned over lunch after church with the congregation members that virtually every single woman divorced their husbands when they moved to the States. They had people come to welfare people pointing out, you're going to get so much more money if you're single, if you're divorced, if you're a single mother. And the more children you've got single without a husband, the more money you get. And so just about all of them, they'd never known this kind of power before and the temptations. And it's like every family that moved to the States, their families broke up. And here's in the congregations, and the pastors were confirming, the husbands were confirming, even some of the women were confirming, the whole social cohesion, their families broke to pieces in America because of all the free things and incentives being given. And then there's my wife was brought up in Austria, and she said, she loved Austria, she loved the Alps, she loved skiing. The greatest sacrifice for her coming to Africa was giving up skiing. And Lenora said when she went back to a reunion party of her school in Austria, she said, I praise God that I'm not bringing up my boys in a godless society like Austria. And she said, I'm the only member of my class who, or grade, that's married. All of her friends, they're either divorced or they haven't got married, they're living in sin and so on. And they even explained to her, we get taxed heavier if we're married. We get taxed better and we get more benefits if we are single mothers and so on. So literally the state was incentivizing people in Austria not to get married, and all of these sort of taxpayer-funded programs of welfare, they're counterproductive. And that I know from personal contact, what I've seen on the ground, and going into squatter camps and ministering and speaking to the people, you can see the welfare programs that are meant to help actually harm. And the scripture even says that the compassions of the wicked are cruel. You might have good intentions, but it doesn't always work that way.
Are there studies that show a pattern of abuse in governments and political structures?
Yes, such as Thomas Sowell's The State Against Blacks, but I would point to an even more damning one. Professor Rummel of Hawaii University, who's a professor of political science. He wrote the book Death by Government, that he showed that far from protecting and serving their citizens, governments in the 20th century proved to be the greatest killers, the greatest oppressors of their own citizens. And this has been, of course, well documented also in the Black Book of Communism. But death by government coins a new term, speaking about democide, where even democracies are killing their own people, and that death by government is a reality. And he documents not just the obvious cases of Ottoman Turkey and the Soviet Union, Red China and Uganda and Cambodia, Rwanda, but documents what's going on in Western countries as well, where Western countries are literally promoting everything from contraception, sterilization, abortion, bringing down the population dramatically. Take, for example, the fact that, before the First World War, the average European woman was having 8 to 12 children. And you just have to go back to before the Anglo-Boer War. President Paul Kruger's wife had 17 children. And you can imagine the devastation of the concentration camps during the Anglo-Boer War, which wiped out tens of thousands of Boer women and children. Absolutely catastrophic for the growth of our people. The largest ethno-linguistic group in South Africa would be the Afrikaners today. But for the wiping out of that key amount of women and children at that critical stage in the development of the Afrikaans people in Transvaal and Orange Free State. But now, since then, just think after the First World War, there was a lot of pressure to get women into the workplace, factories and so on. They first of all had to take the place of the men, many of whom had not just been conscripted but killed in the trenches. And so they literally deliberately increased the taxes on people in England to force women to also go to the workplace. And this was deliberate policy, the goal being, if you get more women in the workplace, they'll have less children, which is a documented fact. Women who have full-time employment are less likely to have that many children. Full-time mothers at home might have a large number of children. And I know some homeschooling moms in America who've got 12 children and more. So you can plainly see, whereas people who are following a career, they're not going to have that many children. And that's just an economic necessity. So there was a deliberate choice in the Western world. We're going to force women out of the household into the workplace, increase the taxes, including property taxes, which was innovated. Before the 20th century, income tax was unknown. And America and Britain started to introduce taxes on property about the time of the First World War. And at first it was just for the super wealthy, but later it came to everyone. And the goal was specifically get the woman into the workplace, force every home to have a two-income household, or they won't survive. We'll be taking away their properties and so on. And so property taxes and overtaxing income tax was a critical part. And so they've brought down the number of people in their own countries. In countries traditionally white, Western, Christian, they have had massive decrease of population and fertility. And that's part of the goal of the globalists. And death by government is certainly one of the best documentations of how governments kill and oppress their own citizens.
In 2025, President Donald Trump launched an extraordinary investigation into the abuse of taxpayer-funded activities in the USA. What did this Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, uncover?
Well, they uncovered colossal abuse, more than any of us could have ever imagined, even those of us who are well-informed and knew a lot of stories and anecdotes about abuse of government funds. And, well, there's no such thing as government funds. It's actually taxpayers' funds, let's face it. Government doesn't use their own money. They use taxpayer money. So when people speak about free, well, nothing's free. Somebody's paying for it, which is normally the poor, middle-class, hard-working families. But not just millions, hundreds of billions of dollars were proven to have been misspent on outrageous, frivolous projects like transgender surgeries and LGBTQ plays and concerts in countries as far away as Guatemala, Ireland, Afghanistan, even irrigation systems for poppy-growing drug dealers in Afghanistan. You just can't make this sort of thing up. DEI concerts and propaganda, but they also used billions and billions to promote, coordinate and fund destructive revolutions like the so-called Arab Spring. of 2011 to 2012, which was under Barack Hussein Obama, and his Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton. They toppled stable governments in the Middle East and led to violent upheavals throughout the Middle East and vast amount of damage, and millions of refugees stimulated to move these destabilized countries up, like from Libya and so on, that they toppled into Europe, invading Europe and creating a demographic time bomb, which we haven't seen the end of. But we also learned that USAID put $6 billion into bringing about the 2014 Mayan revolution or coup in Ukraine, which overthrew the elected government in Ukraine and led to such destabilization, such corruption and conflict that has devastated that region, because one of the first things that this US puppet government that they installed in 2014 through USAID corruption in Kiev in Ukraine was to launch a war against its own Russian-speaking citizens, such as in the Donbass region, which led to them to plead for help from Russia to free them from the oppression of Ukraine, who was trying to annihilate them, literally shooting missiles, bombing, rocketing, artillery barrages on civilian centers in eastern Ukraine, just because they were Russian-speaking. And that war hasn't ended yet. So that was all funded by USAID, right down to gay pride marches organized in Cape Town, and rigging elections all over Africa, and training hundreds of gay activists in countries as far afield as Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, promoting abortion, all sorts of disgusting things funded by USAID, which had nothing to do with helping people as much as creating havoc in the world. And so Doge did a great job in exposing the kind of things governments fund. I mean, that was maybe an extreme example, but I wouldn't be surprised if most governments in the world and the West have something like that going on, like USAID funding things that are nefarious, to put it nicely.
The administration of justice is a cornerstone of government. How are governments doing when it comes to ensuring that crimes are punished and citizens are protected?
Well, I think the Jeffrey Epstein human trafficking child abuse network, which implicates senior members of governments and CEOs of corporations worldwide, it demonstrates how, in many cases, governments are dominated by satanic pedophiles who manage to escape justice. And you think how the Jeffrey Epstein human trafficking child abuse pedophile network, it continued under the Bushes, it continued through the Clintons, it continued through the Barack Hussein Obamas and the Biden era, and only now is it being exposed under Donald Trump, who's getting a lot of the blame, even though he's the one exposing it. And the United Kingdom imprisons vastly more people for what they think and say and even pray than Russia does. And Russia's not only larger than the United Kingdom, it's involved in a war. But Russia imprisoned something like 4,000 people in the last year for things they said or did, which was considered to be subversive in a time of war. Well, that's less than what Britain locked up in the Second World War for advocating peace and negotiations. Over 5,000 people, including members of the royal family and members of parliament and members of the House of Lords, including generals and admirals, were locked up without trial under Winston Churchill during the Second World War. Now, that's during war. But Britain last year had over 16,000 people locked up for thought crimes, for things they said online, for literally posts on social media, and in one case of a poor woman, a grandmother, praying outside an abortion clinic. And to watch the video, it's unreal. It's like George Orwell 1984 thought crime. Police walk up to this woman and say, "Are you praying?" Yes, I was. What were you praying about? Does it matter? Yes, ma'am, you're in a no prayer zone. No prayer zone? Yes. She's opposite from an abortion clinic on the other side of the road, and prayer is not allowed. Praying quietly in her mind, not even speaking aloud, not with a megaphone, not with posters, not with billboards, not with banners. She was arrested for praying silently. I mean, how extreme can that be? This is how it's come to, is that people in Britain get arrested not for molesting kids. They had a massive scandal there, the rape gangs, grooming gangs in Britain, where 1 million girls were abused in Britain over a 20-year period, with the Child Protection Services refusing to act on many complaints, for the police refusing to act, even Scotland Yard refusing to act on Pakistani and other Muslim rape gangs that were grooming young girls for abuse. Totally failed. 1 million girls abused over a 20-year period. But Tommy Robertson goes to jail because he blows the whistle on it. So Tommy Robertson's main crime was being the whistleblower, exposing this. And so incredible how the whistleblower goes to jail, not the actual rapists and pedophiles. That's how justice has been abused in so much of the world today. And so you see how satanic pedophiles in America get away and escape justice over how many administrations. And I heard a joke in Zambia about this. This is a Zambian telling me a joke about ANC-led South Africa. The South African ambassador was introduced to the Zambian Minister of Naval Affairs. And the ambassador declared, "That's ridiculous. Zambia's a landlocked country. You can't have a Minister of Naval Affairs." And the Zambian official countered, "But in South Africa, you have a Ministry of Justice." Now, that's funny, but it's also tragic, because it's actually true.
It is often said that you can always be sure of death and taxes. Are taxes being fairly raised and wisely spent?
No, definitely not. The Bible declares any tax as high as 10% is oppression, by definition. And the Bible forbids taxing of property. I mean, the government doesn't own a property, they're civil servants. How can it tax your property? You think you owned your property, you worked your whole life to pay for your property, but at the end, the government can take it away from you for not paying their rates and taxes, which some people who've retired, who spent their whole life paying for their property, they thought they owned their property. They couldn't maintain the exorbitant rates and taxes and lost their property and now have had to go back to work, people in their 70s, 80s, renting a little hovel somewhere because they can't afford the house that they paid for in their whole life. That is oppression. And the Bible forbids any government to tax property. God forbids the taxing of inheritance. To tax the dead is expressly forbidden. And yet governments do that, which of course is a key part of the Marxist manifesto of 1848, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. To tax property is a key part of how they undermine the whole ruling class, as they put it. If anyone's watched the Downton Abbey, you'll be aware of that look into society 100 years ago, how one of the biggest problems was when the British government started to tax properties, which destroyed these great houses that were providing employment and stability for many communities. And thousands of these great houses and estates around Britain, such as Downton Abbey, were lost and destroyed, cut up and reparceled up and demolished and so on, in the wake of the taxes that were brought out on the people of Britain at that stage. Now, in South Africa, every rand that the Western Cape pays in national taxes, only about 8 cents is actually spent within the Western Cape. And we're not saying well spent. I mean, that involves corruption, BBBEE, affirmative action jobs for comrades and all that. There's a lot of wastage. But literally, if and when the Cape of Good Hope secedes from the SA Titanic, we'll be able to dramatically cut our taxes to about 10% of what they are now. And we'd probably have more money to spend on needs and services and infrastructure in the Western Cape. So we could also be free of so-called load shedding, which are power failures and blackouts, scheduled power failures, because the Western Cape's actually energy self-sufficient, and the only reason we ever have power failures or what they call load shedding, scheduled blackouts, is because so much of our electricity is shared on the grid with other parts of the country, not energy self-sufficient. So yes, the Bible forbids also taxing full-time servants of the Lord. Even the choir masters and others working in the temple were not allowed to be taxed in the Bible. Ezra makes that clear. No taxing of full-time servants of the Lord. Reason is they are supported by taxpayers who have already paid their taxes with free will offerings as unto the Lord. So to tax people who are involved in the full-time service of the Lord is like trying to tax God and tax the church, which is unacceptable. Just take one example. In the old South Africa, Bibles were tax exempt. So was bread, by the way. But anyway, and that's back when we had 4% sales, what was it? It was GST, General Sales Tax. Now we've got 14, 15% value-added tax. Well, at that stage, Bibles were tax exempt. So if somebody donated 100 Rand to me for Bibles for Angola, I could put 100 Rand into buying Bibles for Angola, which, by the way, at that stage was 2 Rand for a hardcover Bible. 2 Rand a Bible. Today, it's more than 200 Rand for a Bible. Just to give you one indication of how things have changed and how money's been devalued. But to tax churches, to tax Bibles, is to tax God. It's unacceptable. And so, yes, a lot of taxes are being wasted. A lot of taxes are unjust. In fact, most of the taxes raised, and even the rates and taxes, are going to people who don't pay taxes. I think we've only got something like 9% income tax payers in South Africa. And so it's bizarre that we're in a situation where the majority of taxpayers in this country didn't vote for the government. And the American Revolution was built on no taxation without representation. And here we are having plainly people being taxed for things that are not going to pay for their services. In fact, it's going to be used to incite more land invaders and parasites to come in who won't contribute to the economy, but they will lead to a massive increase in crime and force you to build more walls and fences and security gates and put spikes on tops of your walls and razor wire and pay for private security because you're not going to get the help from the police that you're paying taxes for. And so we're in a situation where the government is stealing from us all the time. And they're devaluing our currency. That's another story entirely. So just take, for example, when South Africa experienced the Mandela Revolution, 1994, it was roughly 2 Rand to the dollar, roughly. Now, when I was growing up, it used to be $3 for the Rand. The Rand was 3 times more powerful than the average dollar. Actually, I'm speaking about Rhodesian dollar. The Rhodesian dollar was worth 3 American dollars. And the South African Rand was, I think, 2.4 Rand to the dollar. So the Rand was much stronger than dollar, more than double the power of the dollar. And that's back in the 70s as I was growing up. Well, because of sanctions, because of terrorism, because of disinvestment and all the rest of it, the riots and so on, by 1994, when the National Party government handed over to the ANC, or the cancer government, small c, capital ANC, small er. ANC is the middle letter of cancer. But when that happened and Mandela became president, it was roughly 2 Rand to the dollar. By the end of Nelson Mandela's first 5 years in office, it was about 10 Rand to the dollar. Today we're about 17 Rand to the dollar at this stage. So you can see there's other ways of stealing from people, not just extortion through overtaxation, but extortion through devaluing the currency, which destroys your savings, your earnings, your pensions, all of that. And how many pensioners who worked and paid and built up this country and have lost their homes because of rates and taxes, and their pension funds have been looted and their savings have been debased. So governments harm their own citizens in a horrible way.
A previous president in South Africa once famously declared that corruption doesn't hurt anyone. What is the reality when it comes to the issue of corruption?
Corruption hurts everybody. The African Union Task Force on Corruption documented that over 25% of the total gross domestic product, GDP of Africa, that's a quarter of the GDP of Africa, is stolen by government corruption every single year. That, by the way, is over 10 times all the foreign aid received by Africa. And Africa gets a lot of foreign aid. But just think, we don't need any foreign aid if we would just either bring down corruption or eliminate it altogether. And Africa doesn't need foreign aid. We just need to reduce foreign local corruption, or eradicate preferably. So by this estimation, the ANC government steals about 1 trillion Rand every year through corruption. 1 trillion Rand. Do you have any idea what 1 trillion Rand is? So if you put 100 Rand notes stacked on pallets, and that's about a ton per pallet, and you double stack the pallets, you could fill a soccer field from corner to corner, which is bigger than the wingspan of a 747 jumbo jet and the full length of it. So you put $1 trillion, it'll fill a soccer field double stacked on pallets. That's a ton a pallet. And that's how much is stolen by government corruption every single year. And to think people can get arrested for shoplifting or undervaluing on their tax returns or something like that. But yet governments get away with stealing billions and trillions of rands. And by the way, just take another theft. BBBEE, broad-based black economic empowerment, affirmative action, race laws, race quotas, have been calculated to have transferred about R1 trillion to 100 individuals over the last 30 years. So 100 individuals benefited to the tune of R1 trillion because of BBBEE, affirmative action, race-based laws. And this impoverished the rest and debased the services and the infrastructure. And I think we've had the Willem Pitzer group and others doing studies saying the destruction of the infrastructure of South Africa by the ANC, while they've been government for 30 years, has exceeded over 17 trillion rands worth of damage done to water, purification, roads, railways and other services in the country. So they've stolen from us on so many different ways. And I don't think there's the only governments in the world. You can say there's a lot of theft from the citizens of the country and debasing of their currency and their savings and pensions.
The protection of borders has long been considered an essential duty of government. How are governments doing on this front, Dr. Hammond?
Well, the American journalist Tucker Carlson has recently completed a documentary, Replacing Europe, showing how Western governments have systematically, deliberately opened their borders to an unprecedented influx and invasion of foreigners to forever change the demographic composition of Europe. But then he points out it's not just Europe, it's also Canada, North America, the United States. By some estimations, more than 20 million illegal aliens invaded the United States of America during just the 4-year term of Joe Biden alone. And there are more than 30 million illegal aliens in the United States right now. So the Great Replacement is not a theory. It's an actual observable program. Some have written of how Europe is becoming Eurabia, and I've read of some people describing London as Londonistan. British people are now the minority in their own capital, London, and having been to London just over a year ago, I noticed that. I mean, you just can't help but walk around London and see not only are the people wearing less clothes than ever before and more tattooed than ever before, and the women more immoral visibly than ever before, but it's plain that British people are the minority in their own capital. And there's 60 cities in the United Kingdom that have Muslim mayors, including London. And now New York also has a Muslim mayor. And so I could also observe most of the people living in South Africa today were not actually born in South Africa. And I'm one of the minority of people living in Cape Town who was actually born in Cape Town. We have got vast amounts of people pouring into the country because of freebies they can get, especially from the DANC in Cape Town, who are offering incentives to illegal migrants to pour in and build up squatter camps, and they'll provide them with free electricity and free water and build them schools and hospitals and everything else like that. So they're incentivizing foreigners to come here at the expense of local ratepayers in order to, they think, change the demographics to their advantage, because they think these people vote for them because they're giving them lots of free stuff. Although it's been now documented by internal studies by the DA that the people they bring in are overwhelmingly not voting for them. They're voting for the ANC or one of its more radical spin-offs like the EFF. So that basically speaking, they're importing a demographic time bomb that's going to destroy their control. So the DA deluded themselves that the more illegals we bring in and economic migrants, as one person put it, and he was thrown out of the city council for saying so. But they are economic migrants, and you could also say illegal aliens if you use the American term. And they are not only destroying a lot of Cape Town to the extent that we're now talking about a phenomenally expensive wall to be built along the N2 to prevent the squatter camps on the side continually turning the N2 into what's been called a hell run. And as I've got to drive down at N2 quite often, it's quite clear. I remember driving down the N2 and you couldn't see the mountains ahead. You couldn't see anything to left or right because there were forests both sides. You drive from the time you passed the DF Milan airport in Cape Town, there was forest both sides, and you couldn't even see the mountain going up the Solaris Pass because there was forest on both sides of the road. And even when you got to the top of Solaris Pass and you drove there, you had forest on both sides, which now has turned into squatter camps in what's a water catchment area, meant to be protected forestry areas, but instead there's pollution coming into our water supplies, because of illegals being encouraged to take over nature reserves. And you can go to Hermanus and see Cape Town in miniature, where this once beautiful retirement village, which was being called the Monaco of Africa, and a beautiful place where a lot of people went for holidays and retirement and so on. They've chopped down the entire milkwood forest. The milkwood forest, which is a endangered species of flora, has been destroyed to accommodate the illegal aliens who've taken over. And not only that, the city council, the DA, people have run around giving them title deeds, free electricity and free water for these land invaders who are devaluing the homes and properties in Hermanus. Not to mention increasing the crime, and a section of the society that didn't used to know what crime was now has to build high walls, security gates, and all the rest of it because of the danger of theft from people who have poured into the area, being subsidized by the government. And just at a recent town council meeting, ratepayers were evicted by order of the DA councillor there. They brought in the police to evict people who were questioning what they were doing. Now, people are coming out to vote. So once they got the people who were verbally speaking out against and questioning the DA's activities, then they were able to win the vote because they'd removed the people who would vote against their policy. I mean, how's that for city council activities? And that's just Hermanus, which is one example. So this is actually what the World Economic Forum globalists, New World Order architects have been advocating for decades. They used propaganda of overpopulation and promoting the need for two-income households, overtaxing to force mothers into the workplace to pay for the increased taxes, heavily promoted contraception, abortion, sterilization, to dramatically bring down the indigenous population of nations which have traditionally been Christian, while replacing them with foreign populations more amenable to political manipulation and control, and more likely to vote for the New World Disorder globalist agenda.
The health of citizens has often been considered a priority of government. Many hospitals are nationalized. How are governments doing when it comes to health?
Not very well at all, especially when you consider how much medical health tourism has increased from countries like Canada and Great Britain, which have national health services. Yet their citizens see the need to travel to other countries for services, which are offered free, so-called free, in their own country. So I met a British nurse who flew to Cape Town for medical treatment that theoretically she's able to get free in Britain. So, of course, I asked her, she's in the same ward that my wife was, as she is in there for cancer treatment. And so asked this British nurse, what about your national health care? She says, well, yes, I could get it free in Britain, but I'd be dead by the time I got to the head of the queue, because even though she is a nursing sister in Great Britain, there's such a long queue because of all the illegal aliens and all the migrants that have flooded into Britain. They get priority. And someone who's working as a nurse in NHS in Britain, she had to buy her own air ticket, fly to Cape Town to get the treatment that NHS says you get for free in Britain. So that's not a great recommendation. And every year, not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Canadians travel south of the border to the United States to pay for medical care there that officially the Canadian government says you can get for free in Canada. Why would they do that if it's working well? So it's obviously not working well. But it gets worse than that, indeed, because they've got MAID. MAID is M-A-I-D, Medical Assistance in Dying, heavily promoted in Canada. The Canadian government has made a priority, and they've incentivized their own medical professionals to promote medical assistance in suicide, even for patients who are only suffering from depression and have no terminal illness. So you get some teenager, doctor, I'm depressed. Have you considered our medical assistance in dying? We can help you commit suicide. And no, I just want some treatment for depression. No, but this could really benefit you. And can you imagine it? Here's a government wanting to kill their own citizens. And there's a researcher into this who is a Canadian veteran, a woman who served in Afghanistan, and she's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And she, when she went for help to deal with PTSD, was recommended suicide. And so she's done a whole documentation and testified recently Over 95% of those in Canada who've had their lives terminated by medical professionals are white Canadian Christians. And so Canada's literally killing their own citizens, taxpayers, to make space for refugees from the Middle East and the Third World. They're bringing in jihadists even, while they are executing their own veterans who served in Afghanistan, for example. Not that they wanted to go there, the government sent them there. And isn't that incredible? Canada is literally killing their own citizens to make space for refugees from the Middle East. So the great replacement theory is not a theory. In Canada, it's a practical reality, it's government policy, and it's observable.
Education departments consume a huge amount of the national budget. How effective have governments been in education?
Well, it would be more accurate to speak about indoctrination. Education should be teaching students how to think critically. But indoctrination is telling students what they must think. Most Western governments today are keeping more in with the indoctrination like we were warned about by George Orwell in his 1984 book. So realistically, if you just look at the kind of nonsense going on in education, you can see that it's a failure by how home education, private education is growing. A massive growth industry is private, independent Christian schools. Now, people would not be going to private, independent Christian schools if the government schools were doing such a good job. And families like mine wouldn't have been involved in home education for our children if it wasn't for the fact that the government schools are such a total and utter catastrophe. I mean, it's a lot of extra work. Why would parents go for homeschooling if the government schools are doing a good job? So it's a total failure. At the moment in America, there are over 6 million homeschooling children being homeschooled. So homeschooling families are a major growth industry. When I started to promote homeschooling in South Africa, we had 30 years ago 3 curriculum providers at the first Homeschool Expo. And Christian Liberty Books was one of them. It was Theocentric Christian Education, the oldest, Accelerate Christian Education, which was primarily for Christian schools, but they started to adapt also their curriculum for homeschoolers, and Christian Liberty Books. And Christian Liberty Books are importing books from all over the world to provide textbooks for homeschoolers. And the last home education expo we went to in October last year, there were over 100 curriculum providers. So obviously homeschool is here to stay, and it's a growth industry. And the private Christian schools is huge amounts more. There wasn't one private school in my suburb of Pinellas when I first got married. Now there are 2 that I know of which are doing very well, and they're growing and expanding and adding, and so plainly, and that's just one suburb. So you can see all over the country, private schools are growing and state schools are dysfunctional. When we had a government school inspector come to our home to inspect that we are doing a good job with homeschooling our children, I asked him, "Where do you send your children?" And he looked at me like, "Are you crazy?" Of course, a private school. So homeschool inspectors, government inspectors even, won't send their children to their own schools. And then look at how many government school teachers send their children to private schools. And that's not just true for America, it's true in South Africa too. You've seen a lot of people who are teachers in a state school, their children don't go to the state school. Just like consider the fact that all of the high-tech company CEOs, and you're talking about Mark Zuckerberg and the head of Google and so on, their children go to schools that ban computers and ban cell phones, where it's all analog and that you're not even allowed to bring a cell phone on the property. But apparently people like Mark Zuckerberg and the head of
Facebook,
all those places like Google and so on, they don't even let their children have cell phones. So, what does that tell you? Some people don't believe in their own product. Just take this one. I met the Minister of Health in South Africa a while ago. It was last year. I was at a conference, and I asked the man, do you and your family use state hospitals? No, they don't. They go to private hospitals. Now, how can the Minister of Health be allowed to take his family and himself go to private hospitals? Surely they should believe in their own product. And the Minister of Education probably doesn't even send his children to a government school. I think every member of government should be forced to use government schools and government hospitals, but they don't. Why not? Just take, for example, Robert Mugabe, dictator of Zimbabwe. When he went shopping, he didn't go to Harare. He went to Singapore. He flew to Singapore, chartered a private plane to do his shopping there. When he was sick, he went to Singapore hospitals or to Johannesburg private hospitals. He didn't use the government hospitals of Zimbabwe. Now, I remember when P.W. Botha was president of South Africa, he went to two military hospitals, that's Wynberg Military Hospital, whenever he needed any medical checkup or treatment or surgery. Now, when last did we have a president who trusted in his own state hospitals for medical care? I don't think there's anyone in our government today who would be happy to use a government hospital, including the Minister of Health. But would even the Minister of Defence use the military hospitals like 1 mil or 2 mil? So, that's a major answer about how governments harm you. When governments aren't willing to use their own facilities, then that's a major vote of no confidence in their own products.
Are there biblical solutions to these patterns of abuse?
Yes, indeed, there certainly are. Decentralization, restoring municipalities to their ratepayers, limited government, separation of powers, the rule of law, such as found in Magna Carta, the Great Charter of 1215, parental control of education. Nobody cares for your children more than the parents. To suggest that some secular cocaine-sniffing pedophiles in government are more concerned for the good of your children than you are is insane. We need freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, all of which are attacked by governments today. Freedom of association, abolition of income tax, abolition of taxing of property. There's no need to tax property. No taxing of those involved in the full-time service of the Lord. Those in the full-time service of the Lord are relying on free will offerings as unto the Lord. No inheritance should be taxed. So if we would follow biblical principles for government, as Jesus enunciated, where Jesus said that you to render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Now, children are not made in the image of Caesar, they're made in the image of God, and they're entrusted to the parents. Parents should not entrust their children's education in the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites and the people, and Amalek and the people who hate God. So really and truly, we've got to get back to biblical principles. To hell with the globalist centralization agenda, we need to go to decentralization, all the way down to decentralized to real municipalities, where the actual ratepayers control the local police and control the local economy and area. So people who are invested in their community have the votes on their municipalities, not just parasites and economic migrants and refugees and people who've got no investment and have no stake in the future. They shouldn't be the ones outnumbering the ratepayers, where people become a minority in their own country and their own community, and then find their hard-earned money and their properties being devalued by people who've just come in to replace them. So this is criminal. We must return to biblical principles. No taxation without representation. These are biblical principles.
Dr. Hammond, where can listeners learn more about God and government and biblical solutions to contemporary problems?
Well, Christian Liberty Books has many great resources in these subjects, and that includes the God and Government series by Gary DeMar and Biblical Principles for Africa, which I wrote, which is also now in Afrikaans too, Bijbelse Beginsels for Africa. South Africa, Renaissance or Reformation, covers a lot of these issues as well. The 10 Commandments, God's Perfect Law of Liberty, and, of course, a case for secession, which has now been completed in Afrikaans and will be available in both English and Afrikaans soon. So these are just some, but if you contact www.christianlibertybooks.co.za or write to admin@christianlibertybooks.co.za, you will be given lots of suggestions of what helps when it comes to contemporary problems and the biblical solutions.
Thank you for the overview of the state of affairs in government, Dr. Hammond. I'd like to close by reading from Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11. And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. Thank you very much for joining us for From the Frontline. God bless and good night.